I turned 65 in late October, and 3 weeks later I buried my husband. The chapel in Willow Bay, our small Oregon town stitched to the coast like a seam that never held, smelled of rain and lilies. People I hadn't seen in years pressed my hands, spoke softly, set their condolences down like folded napkins, and drove back to their intact lives. The house felt cavernous after, as if Daniel had taken the ballast with him and left me to drift. His wool cardigan was still slung over the porch chair. A teacup with a hairline crack waited beside the sink, a small mouth that would never speak. Grief changes ordinary noises. The clock in the hallway clicked louder, insistently. Floorboards developed memories and told them to my feet. By twilight, the wind off the harbor had started one of its long conversations, leaning through the eaves as if trying to persuade me to follow it. The telephone rang just after dusk, not the sleek rectangle face down on the table. That one sat silent like a sealed letter, but the dusty landline I kept for storms and older neighbors. Its bell sounded old-fashioned and too bright for that dark hour. I watched it flash, thought of letting it jump to the answering machine, and finally lifted the receiver because I'm a woman who still answers. Raised that way, and habits are a kind of prayer. Mrs. Knox. A woman's voice, careful and hushed. Yes. My throat rasped. In a mirror across the room, I caught my posture, formal, as if the right angle of my back could make something proper again. My name is Mara Hale. Breath on the line, gathering nerve. I knew Daniel. Knew. Past tense. I leaned against the sideboard so I wouldn't sway. A lot of people knew my husband. Not like I did, she said, and silence spilled between us. It wasn't the harsh kind. It was the kind you turn a photograph toward the light to examine. I'm not young, she added quickly, apologetically, as if she thought I would picture red lipstick and recklessness. I'm 63. I teach piano to neighborhood kids when their parents can pay. When they can't, I bake muffins and pretend it's currency. I'm not calling to cause trouble, Mrs. Knox. I'm calling because trouble is already here. The words did not zing. They didn't sting. They arrived like a snow squall you could see moving across the water. You should know, she went on, that he told me a different story about you, about everything. It was all fog and half-truths, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because there are loans, agreements, things I didn't sign, and yet my name is on, and yours is too. Inside my chest, something that had been politely grieving raised its head. I walked to the window because stillness would have made me say something unwise. Below, the street lamp threw a circle on the pavement. Daniel used to stand in that glow in winter while he scraped ice from the windshield, humming off-key. Ordinary, kind pictures rushed me first, as if my mind wanted to defend the dead with wholesomeness. Then other images flared, the checking account I was never invited to see, a credit card bill that arrived once with a balance I couldn't place, his gentle hand covering mine while he said it wasn't important. Mrs. Knox, Mara said, almost whispering, I'm in trouble. The bank called 3 days after the obituary. They read numbers to me as if they were reading a storm warning. They say I'm responsible. Then a collection office called and used my first name as if they owned it. When I looked at the papers, I saw your signature where it couldn't possibly be, and mine where mine never went. I didn't sign anything, I said. The words came out level and low. The older you get, the more you hear your mother in your mouth when you're telling the truth. I believe you, she answered, instantly grateful. I could hear that small mercy ripple through her. I believe you because I didn't either. He told me not to worry, that it was some bundled nonsense, the way finance is a language no one but bankers should understand. And then he took his last breath and left me speaking to strangers about terminology I can't pronounce. I pressed my palm flat to the cold glass without meaning to. Below, a stray cat paused beneath the lamppost like punctuation. The harbor let out a long metal sigh. What do you do when a stranger calls from the other side of your marriage? What do you owe your rival when the referee has left the field? I'm sorry for what you're facing, I said, and I meant the words. I truly did, but they floated uselessly like petals set adrift. I don't know how to help. I thought you might say that, she murmured. In the background, a piano key chimed, middle C, brittle and true. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a pair of eyes that loved the same man I did. Not the same way, I know, but we were mapped by the same storm system. I thought if we looked together, maybe we could see the pattern he drew over our lives. There are sentences that feel like keys when they arrive. Her plea slid into a lock I wasn't ready to admit existed, and yet something resistant in me bristled. I saw how easily pity could be mistaken for permission, how quickly compassion could be harnessed to drag you where you didn't plan to go. Ms. Hale, I said gently, I'm not ready for this. Not tonight. I understand. She inhaled, steadying herself the way people do who have practiced falling with grace. Would it be all right if I left you my number? If you change your mind, even in anger, call. I'll answer. That's a promise I know how to keep. She recited digits slowly. I wrote them on the edge of a grocery list and circled them twice, then stared at the looped ink as if it might rearrange into a different fate. When I hung up, the house listened to me. That's what it felt like, a structure that had heard more than it admitted, now waiting to see what I would do with the hearing. I moved through the rooms as dusk deepened, past the framed photo of our daughter in Albuquerque with the grin she got from me, past the shelf where Daniel kept his fishing licenses, past the quilt my sister stitched the year he had pneumonia, and I slept in a chair so I could count his breaths. I didn't sleep. The night extended itself like a hallway that forgot where it ended. Toward morning, I dozed and dreamed our old Buick rolled backward down a hill with no one steering. I woke to sea wind and the sound of the landline again. It was the bank this time. A woman with a bright, trained voice asked for me by my full name and then began to describe instruments, as if we were discussing music. I asked her to repeat, more slowly. She did, and I took notes, and there it was, 2 lines of credit. One in my name with an address that wasn't mine, one in a name that wasn't mine at all, tethered to my social. Both marked joint. Each tied to Daniel in a way that had bypassed every part of me that had vowed in front of the minister to be part of his every part. When the call ended, I put my face in my hands. Some tears come like summer storms. Some arrive like fog and sit, gentle and unrelenting. These were the latter. I remembered the day I told him yes, under a maple tree behind the city library. We were 32 and brave and didn't know what the word really meant. I remembered the silence we taught each other, too, the kind where you don't ask why, because the answer might start an argument you'd rather save for never. I remembered his warmth in January and the way he could fix a hinge and hum while doing it, which is how love distracts you from counting the screws. By noon, practicalities pulled me upright. I gathered envelopes from the desk drawer, made copies of the will, found Daniel's pocket notebook of odds and ends, garden measurements, a list of movies he meant to see, and discovered a green folder I'd never noticed. Inside, a ledger in his cramped block handwriting. Dates, amounts, notations like bridge loan and consolidation that felt like stones tucked into my coat. My hands shook so much I had to sit. I would like to pretend that what pushed me to call Mara wasn't pride. But if honesty is the only inheritance that doesn't appreciate, then let me say it plain. I could tolerate being deceived in private. I could not tolerate being publicly diminished, dragged into offices where people would lower their voices and wonder how a woman like me let that happen. I didn't want to be the last to know my own story. When I dialed, she answered in half a ring. Mara speaking. It's Eleanor, I said. I chose my given name because it felt less married. I'd like to meet. Relief softened her words. Thank you. Bring everything you have, I added, surprising myself with the firmness that stepped into my voice like a friend who arrived late but on time. We'll look together. Then we'll decide. I can come to Willow Bay, she offered. There's a small place on Harbor Street. Old brick, crooked tables, good cinnamon rolls. Late afternoon. 4, I said, as if I had a calendar crowded with other appointments. And after we set the hour, we hung up with a mutual quiet that felt almost polite. I dressed as if for a deposition. Dark skirt, camellia-colored blouse, my mother's thin gold chain, tucked beneath the collar where it could lie against skin. At the door, I hesitated. On the hook hung Daniel's old coat, the one with the missing button he never replaced because he liked the excuse to tuck his hand in the pocket. I left it there, let it watch me leave. Harbor Street climbs gently before dropping toward the docks. The cafe leaned against the corner like a tired aunt with good stories. I arrived 5 minutes early and chose a table by the window. The harbor beyond was slate-colored, as if someone had sketched it and left before inking the lines. Mara arrived precisely at 4. She was not what gossip imagines. Her hair had gone silver in thoughtful streaks. Her hands were faintly inked with a pianist's ghosts. She wore a navy coat, cheap but clean, and carried a canvas bag swollen with papers. "Mrs. Knox, Eleanor," she corrected herself quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you for coming." "You said you're 63, I replied, gesturing to the chair. "We're close enough to drop the misses. It's for door-to-door salesmen and insurance claims, not for conversations like this." Her smile was small and sincere. She sat. We ordered warm drinks without naming them, just pointing and nodding. 2 women refusing to let ordinary nouns make this scene domesticated. Then she took out a stack of envelopes, and I opened my folder, and we began to put our 2 halves of the same puzzle on one table. As we worked, fragments of him rose from the ink, the same handwriting I had found at home, the same neat loops, the same conservative numbers that added up to audacity, dates that overlapped with anniversaries, holidays, as bout of pneumonia, terms that made my scalp tighten. In one packet, a form where my name sat on a dotted line in a version of my signature that someone had taught his hand to imitate. I looked at it until the letters blurred. "He told me," Mara said carefully, not looking up, "that his wife, his word, liked quiet and disliked banks. He said he handled things to spare you worry. He told me I should be flattered that he trusted me with the logistics of his life. Whenever I asked for proof or clarity, he kissed my knuckles and changed the topic." She swallowed. He was kind in the ways kindness can be used as a leash. I folded my hands so they wouldn't betray me with a tremor. I thought of the maple tree. I thought of nurses' stations and winter coughs and laughter that had grown rare enough to hoard. "Why did you stay?" I asked, softly, the question I had never planned to ask another woman out loud. She met my gaze head-on. "Because he gave me back a version of myself I thought had gone quiet. Because we met late, and late makes people reckless. Because I mistook detail for devotion and secrecy for protection. And because I believed him when he said love was a reason, not an alibi." We sat with that. Outside, a gull strutted along the curb with comic dignity. Inside, our drinks steamed up our faces and then cooled while we didn't touch them. It would have been simple, then, to stand and say I'd heard enough, to leave with my folder and my indignation and let the tide erase our footprints. But simple is not the same as clean, and clean is not the same as right. Somewhere between her last sentence and the sound of a spoon set back on a saucer, a steadier idea arrived. We were not 2 halves of a competition. We were 2 witnesses to the same magician's trick. And magicians count on isolation more than applause. I will not give you pity," I said finally, and watched her absorb it without flinching. "But I will give you something better. Tomorrow morning, we go to Ridge and West Bank together. We ask for their manager. We request copies of every form. We use our full names and our full ages and the weight of exactly what we know." Mara set her spoon down as if it were an oath. "Together," she echoed. "Yes." Around us, the cafe carried on with afternoon rituals. Plates stacked, chair side across the floor. Someone laughed at a joke we would never hear. I slid one of the suspect documents back into its sleeve. The paper whispered. Outside, the harbor lifted and fell, attending to its ancient work. I did not forgive Daniel then. I did not condemn him either. What I felt was sharper and more useful, a clarity that could walk on its own legs. When we stood to leave, Mara touched the rim of her cup in a small, grateful salute, as if to thank the table for holding what it had held. At the door, she hesitated. "I know what I am to you in the story that gets told," she said. "I can live with that. But before we step into that bank tomorrow, could we agree to be two women who refuse to be small?" "We can agree," I said, "and then we can prove it." We stepped into the salt, bright air, two strangers stitched together by the same absence, and turned in the same direction without needing to discuss which way the bank lay. The next morning, the air had that raw coastal chill that seeps through sweaters and asks if you're sure about your choices. Mara was already waiting outside Ridge and West Bank when I arrived. A brick building that pretended to be old-fashioned for credibility, though its glass doors gleamed like a confession booth polished for tourists. She looked smaller in daylight. Grief does that to people. It edits them. Her scarf was the color of wet ash, and she clutched a manila folder against her chest as if it were armor. "Ready?" I asked. "As I'll ever be." Inside, the bank smelled faintly of printer ink and floral disinfectant. A line of customers shuffled toward the tellers, everyone murmuring, paper whispering, money breathing its careful air. We approached the reception desk. A young woman looked up with a customer service smile that wilted slightly when she saw the determination in our eyes. "We need to speak with the branch manager," I said. "It concerns joint accounts under Daniel Knox. Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, and smiled the way teachers used to when they'd caught you lying but were too polite to announce it. "But he'll want to see us." The receptionist made a call, whispered something, and a few minutes later a man appeared. Gray suit, hair parted with mathematical precision, a small badge that said Mr. Delaney. He offered his hand to me first, as if instinctively recognizing who in this duo would least enjoy shaking it. "I understand there's some confusion regarding Mr. Knox's accounts," he said, his voice smooth with practiced patience. "Confusion," I repeated, rolling the word like a pebble in my mouth. "That's one word for it." We followed him to a narrow office of glass walls, privacy achieved only through the illusion that no one was listening. We sat. He adjusted the blinds, folded his hands, and waited for us to begin. Mara placed her folder on the table. "There are loans, two that bear both our names. The signatures are forged. We need copies of everything connected to them." Delaney's expression didn't change, but the faint tightening around his eyes betrayed awareness. "I'll need to verify your identities first." We handed him our driver's licenses. He typed for several minutes, the keyboard clacking like distant footsteps. Then he frowned. "Well," he said carefully, "there are indeed two active lines of credit. One, a consolidated loan opened 19 months ago, $60,000. The second, a smaller revolving line, $12,000, opened last summer. Both list Mr. Knox as primary and you," he glanced from me to Mara, "as co-applicants." "Co-applicants." I leaned forward. I never signed a single document with Daniel in the last 5 years. The only thing we signed together was a mortgage 20 years ago. He hesitated, then retrieved 2 folders from a cabinet and slid them across the table. Inside lay the originals. There was my name in careful blue ink, precise, elegant, familiar, and utterly alien. "That's not my signature," I said. Mara's page was worse. Her last name slanted differently, letters uneven like a hand guessing itself. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Delaney studied us, the neutrality draining from his posture. "Mrs. Knox, Miss Hale, these documents were notarized here, but the notary who handled them retired last winter. I can open an internal review. It will take time." "Do it," I said. "And please note this, we will be filing a police report and bringing our attorney. This conversation never happened otherwise." He nodded, professional courtesy shading into discomfort. Understood. When we stepped back into the street, the wind off the harbor slapped color into our faces. Mara exhaled a sound between a laugh and a sob. He forged us both. He really did. I couldn't tell if she wanted validation or punishment. He must have needed collateral. Maybe he thought the debt would outlive him, crawl toward us after he was gone. "Is that what love is to some men?" she murmured. "A way to borrow against other hearts." We walked without speaking, our steps finding a strange rhythm. On the corner, a bakery spilled the scent of cinnamon and coffee into the cold air. We went in, ordered pastries neither of us tasted. The world outside felt sharper, as if every window pane had been cleaned overnight. Mara unfolded a slip of paper she'd taken from her folder. "There's something else," she said. He listed both our addresses as guarantors on a third loan, one I can't find in the system yet. The statement came yesterday, postmarked from a different state. Wyoming. Wyoming. I repeated. "We've never even—" I stopped. Daniel had taken a business trip there once, years ago. I'd thought it was for a conference. He'd brought back a paperweight shaped like a mountain, said it reminded him of permanence. She placed the statement on the table between us. The amount owed was staggering, $120,000, co-signed by both of us, linked to a storage facility in Cheyenne. What could he possibly have stored there? I asked. "Whatever he didn't want either of us to see," Mara said quietly. The bell over the bakery door jingled as someone left, and for a moment cold air twisted around our ankles. I realized then that grief hadn't been the final chapter. It was only the preface to a longer, crueler story. That evening, I returned home to the silence that had once been comforting. I sat at the kitchen table where Daniel used to read the newspaper, and I began to sort through his old correspondence again. In one envelope, tucked behind a receipt for lumber, I found a key, small, silver, stamped S27. No label, no explanation. I placed it beside the loan statement from Wyoming. The connection clicked like a lock catching. When I called Mara, she answered before the first ring ended. "I found a key," I said. She didn't ask to what. She just whispered. "Then I guess we know where we're going next." Outside, the wind off the Pacific rose again, the sound of waves arguing with rock. Inside, the key gleamed in the low light, waiting for the next truth it would open. I hadn't driven farther than the next county in years. But 3 mornings later, I watched the Oregon coastline disappear in my rearview mirror, the road unspooling east like a slow confession. Mara sat beside me, her canvas bag wedged between her knees, filled with photocopies, letters, and one silver key that glinted whenever sunlight struck it. She had insisted on paying for the gas, and I had let her. A small concession between 2 women learning how to share direction without surrendering control. The radio murmured old jazz through the static. Neither of us talked much. There was a strange comfort in silence that didn't need explaining. Somewhere past Boise, Mara broke it. "Do you ever feel like we're chasing a ghost that's laughing at us?" I kept my eyes on the endless ribbon of asphalt. "No," I said. "Ghosts don't laugh. They wait." She turned to the window, thinking about that. For the next 100 miles, the only sound was wind. Cheyenne greeted us with low clouds and the scent of snow hiding in them. The storage facility sat on the edge of town, rows of corrugated metal doors, each marked with a number and the rust of someone's secrets. Unit S. 27 waited near the back. The office clerk, a young man with a polite boredom, took the key from me, verified the records, and handed it back. "Says here the account holder passed away last month. You're authorized as secondary," he said, glancing at his screen. "Guess you can close it out today." My throat tightened. "Yes," I whispered. "Let's close it." He didn't follow us. No one ever does when the past is about to be opened. The lock turned with a clean metallic sigh. The door groaned upward. Cold air, stale with dust and oil, spilled out. Inside were boxes, neat rows, each labeled in Daniel's meticulous handwriting. Receipts, invoices, photos. And in the far corner, a single wooden trunk. Mara knelt first, brushing away a cobweb. "He packed like a lawyer preparing evidence," she murmured. "Or hiding it," I said. We pried open the trunk. Inside lay ledgers neatly stacked with columns of numbers and initials that weren't ours. Underneath, a folder labeled Partnership Agreement, Harborview Development, LLC. I flipped through it, page after page of loan documents, signatures that mimicked mine, hers, and even false addresses linking both our names to collateral properties across 2 states. It wasn't just debt. It was a web. "Oh my God," Mara breathed. "He used us to build credit for something that never existed." I stared at the documents. Each page told the same story. Daniel had created a phantom partnership, transferring funds between our names, between phantom accounts, feeding one lie to sustain another. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Years," I said. "Maybe longer than either of us realized." In a smaller box beside the trunk, we found letters, hundreds of them, addressed but never sent, to me, to her, to banks, even to my daughter. Some were apologies, others instructions, all written in the same hand that once brushed my hair from my eyes. Mara picked one at random, read it silently, then folded it shut. "He thought he'd fix it before anyone found out," she whispered. "And when he couldn't—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. We worked until our knees ached, documenting everything with our phones, sealing the evidence in separate envelopes. When we stepped outside, the clouds had begun to snow, soft flakes spinning slow circles to the ground. Mara held out her hand, watching one melt on her palm. "You ever think he loved us both?" The question hung like breath in cold air. "Yes," I said finally, "but love isn't the same thing as goodness." That night, in a roadside motel with flickering neon, we spread the papers across 2 beds. The heater rattled, smelling faintly of rust. Mara traced a finger along a page of figures. "We could still be ruined," she said, "even if we prove this wasn't us." "I know. Then why do I feel lighter?" "Because truth is expensive," I said, "and we just made our first payment." She smiled faintly. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching snow drift across the parking lot, headlights cutting through it like brief mercies. Somewhere out there, beyond miles of winter and regret, my daughter lived her life, unaware of how close her mother had come to being erased by a man she'd trusted. I thought about Daniel, not as a husband or a villain, but as a man terrified of losing control, who built lies to keep his world steady. I wondered if, in those last weeks, he realized the weight he'd left us to carry. At dawn, Mara stirred. "What now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "we go home and make sure he never writes another line in our names." We drove west under a bruised sky, the snow thinning to rain, the horizon unfolding into a strange kind of freedom. The road shimmered ahead, endless, and for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like I was following him anymore. I was following myself. By the time we crossed back into Oregon, the snow had turned to fine rain that streaked the windshield like gray silk threads. Mara dozed against the passenger window, her hand still resting on the manila folder she refused to let go of. Every so often, the tires hissed over puddles, and the rhythm steadied my nerves. We didn't speak much after Cheyenne. Some truths are too dense to talk around. They hang in the air like a stone on a string, and all you can do is make sure it doesn't swing toward you. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. Not smaller, but hollow, like someone had lifted it, shaken out all the warmth, and set it back down. I left the trunk open, took only the envelope with the most damning papers, and told Mara I'd call her after I spoke to my lawyer. She squeezed my arm, eyes tired but steady. "Don't let him win, even from the grave," she said. "I won't." Inside, the first thing I did was open every window. The air rushed in cold and clean. sweeping through the silence that had grown stale in Daniel's absence. Then I called Michael Barron, a retired attorney who'd handled the estate of my parents years ago, a man with silver hair and a voice like gravel worn smooth. When I told him I needed to talk about fraudulent documents tied to my late husband, he didn't ask questions. "Bring everything," he said, "and bring whoever else he dragged into this." Mara, and I met him 2 days later in his office overlooking the marina. The room smelled faintly of salt and lemon polish, the kind of scent that made you trust paperwork. He listened as we laid out the documents, his eyebrows climbing higher with each page. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, hands steepled. "Ladies," he said finally, "this isn't a misunderstanding. This is deliberate fraud. Your husband moved money between fake shell companies, using both your names as cover. He even notarized a few documents under an alias. That's a felony." Mara looked sick. "But he's dead. What can we do?" Michael tapped the folder with a pen. "Dead men can't serve time, but their estates can be sued. And the banks can be held accountable if their due diligence failed. We'll need to file a joint civil claim and a criminal report to protect your credit before they come after you for repayment." I nodded, already feeling the fatigue settle into my bones. "We have proof of the forgeries. His handwriting, the false addresses, even a storage key that led us to evidence." "Good," he said. "Then we move fast. The law loves paperwork more than it loves justice. But if you give it enough of both, sometimes you get lucky." That night, Mara stayed at my house. She cooked soup, too salty but warm, while I scanned the documents into digital copies. The living room looked like a war room. Laptops open, paper spread, pens and sticky notes blooming across the coffee table. "Strange," she said softly, setting down 2 mugs of tea. "I keep thinking if we fix this, I'll finally hate him properly. But I don't. I just miss the lie less each day." I looked up from the screen. "Missing the lie means you're healing. The truth's heavier, but at least it doesn't rot." We sat in silence for a long time, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore. The next morning, the bank called, this time a senior manager from headquarters. His tone was careful, cautious. "Mrs. Knox, Ms. Hale, our internal audit confirmed irregularities in those accounts. We'll cooperate fully with law enforcement. You are not liable for the outstanding balances." When I hung up, Mara was watching me from across the table. "That's it?" she asked. "We're free." "From the debt, maybe," I said. "Not from the story." Because stories like ours don't end when the ledger clears. They echo in the spaces left behind, the letters, the silence, the quiet evenings when you wonder how you could sleep beside someone and never see the shadow behind his smile. Later that week, I stood by the ocean behind my house. The tide was high, restless, gnawing at the rocks like a creature that never learned to stop feeding. I scattered a handful of Daniel's old notes into the wind, lists, numbers, half-finished letters. They lifted, twisted, and vanished into the sea spray. "Mara," called that evening. "Michael says we'll have to testify when the investigation starts," she said. "He also said something about the media wanting the story." "Let them want," I replied. "We'll tell it our way, not theirs." She laughed softly. "Eleanor, you sound like someone who just remembered who she was." Maybe I did. That night, before bed, I found one last sealed envelope at the back of Daniel's desk. My name on the front, in his unmistakable handwriting. Inside, a single page, folded twice. If you're reading this, it means I failed to fix what I broke. I wanted to protect you both, but I built my own trap instead. I loved you, both of you. I'm sorry for everything. No explanation, no numbers, just that. For a long time, I sat in the dim light, letting the words sink and dissolve until only the echo remained. I didn't cry. Grief had changed shapes too many times already. Instead, I whispered something small and honest to the empty room. I forgive you for being human, but not for leaving me to clean it up. The courthouse in Portland was nothing like I'd imagined. It wasn't grand or cinematic, just gray walls, humming lights, and the faint smell of paper warmed by fluorescent bulbs. Justice, it turned out, had the same perfume as bureaucracy. Mara and I sat side by side in the hallway outside the hearing room, both dressed in quiet colors. Her hair was pinned neatly, mine left loose. Between us sat the folder that had carried our shared ruin, the one that now, somehow, felt lighter. When the clerk called our names, we stood. My knees reminded me that 65 was not an age for vengeance, but for endurance. Inside, a panel of 3 officials waited. A woman from the bank's compliance division, a state investigator, and a lawyer representing the estate creditors. The last one had the thin smile of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Mr. Barron sat behind us, a steady shadow. He'd prepared us for the questions, timelines, handwriting samples, our relationships with Daniel, every transaction, and every signature. It wasn't an interrogation, but it felt like one, the kind that measures the tremor in your voice more than the truth in your words. When my turn came, I spoke clearly. I told them how my husband had handled all financial matters for years, how trust had been our currency until it lost value. I explained about the call from the bank, the meeting with Mara, the storage unit in Wyoming, the forged papers. One of the officials, a woman about my daughter's age, looked up from her notes. "Mrs. Knox, did you have any indication your husband was in financial distress?" I thought of the quiet nights when he'd sat outside on the porch, staring at the ocean long after I'd gone to bed, the distance in his eyes that I'd mistaken for peace. "No," I said softly. He hid it well. He always believed love was supposed to be effortless. Maybe that's why he built so many lies, to keep the effort invisible. The room stayed silent for a moment too long. Then the investigator nodded, made a note, and turned to Mara. She spoke with her hands folded neatly on the table, voice steady. She told them about the loans, the letters, the fear of collectors calling. Her tone never cracked, but her eyes shimmered once when she said, "I thought I was special to him. I guess I was, just not in the way I wanted." The banker shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Barron caught my glance and gave a tiny nod. We were doing fine. When it was over, the investigator thanked us for our cooperation and promised that the fraudulent accounts would be formally expunged. "You're both victims in this," he said, "and you've handled it with grace." Grace, a polite word for survival. Outside, the air felt fresher than I remembered. Reporters lingered near the steps, not many, just enough to turn whispers into headlines. Someone called my name, asking if I'd comment. I didn't. Mara slipped her arm through mine, guiding us away. Down the block, a coffee stand steamed in the cold. We ordered black coffee in paper cups and sat on a bench overlooking the square. For the first time in months, I laughed, quietly without reason. Mara joined in, a small ripple that felt like breathing again. "You realize," she said, smiling into her cup, "they'll write about this. 2 women, 1 man, 1 mess." "Let them," I said. "Maybe someone will read it and see themselves before it's too late." That night, I returned home to find a small envelope slipped through my mail slot. No return address. Inside, a simple postcard, a photograph of the Oregon coast, taken from the cliffs near our old summer spot. On the back, a single line in an unfamiliar hand. "He loved you both the only way he knew how." No signature. I turned the card over and over, studying the handwriting. Not Daniel's, not anyone I recognized. Perhaps someone from the bank, or a friend he'd confided in before the end. Or maybe no one at all. Just the universe using coincidence to tie its bow. I placed it in a drawer, not with the evidence, but with the keepsakes, somewhere between forgiveness and forgetting. A few days later, Mara and I met one last time at the cafe on Harbor Street where it had all begun. The air smelled of cinnamon again, though the place had been repainted a pale yellow since our first meeting. She arrived wearing the same navy coat, only now it looked less like armor and more like comfort. "So this is the end," she said, stirring her tea. Of this chapter, I corrected. Not of everything. She smiled. Do you think he'd be sorry if he could see us now? I think he'd be surprised, I said. He never believed women could stand together without hating each other. Turns out that was his biggest mistake. We sat in quiet agreement, watching gulls wheel above the harbor, their wings flashing white in the winter light. When we parted, she hugged me, not as a rival, but as someone who had survived the same storm. That night, I wrote the first entry in a new journal. There are kinds of love that build you and kinds that bury you. I've lived through both. The trick is learning which one you're still digging out of. Then I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and for the first time in a long while, slept without dreaming of debts. A year passed before I realized I'd stopped checking the mailbox with dread. Seasons had washed through the town like soft tides. Spring with its hesitant green, summer smelling faintly of sea salt and new paint, autumn leaving the streets rust-red and reflective. I had rebuilt my days into quieter shapes, morning walks, volunteering at the library, learning how to cook for one without feeling lonely about it. People still asked about Daniel sometimes, politely, the way small towns ask about the weather. I always said he's gone, but I'm fine, and left it at that. They nodded, never guessing how much truth could hide in such a simple sentence. Mara had moved inland to Salem to live near her sister. We spoke once a month, sometimes less. Our calls were short, but full of peace instead of panic. We never discussed Daniel anymore, not out of avoidance, but because we'd already said everything worth saying. One evening, she told me, I started teaching piano again. One of my students asked if I'd ever been in love. What did you say? That I've loved and survived it, which is all that matters. Her laughter through the phone sounded freer, rounder, like a window finally opened. I kept that sound in my mind long after the call ended. That winter, I found myself walking the pier one afternoon when the fog rolled in thick and heavy, blurring the horizon into something dreamlike. The ocean murmured below, a constant reminder that even chaos has rhythm. I leaned on the railing, breathing in the salt, and thought of Daniel, not with anger, not even sorrow, but with a strange, gentle clarity. He had built a life out of illusions, and when those illusions cracked, he drowned in the debris. But I was still here. So was Mara. The women he had tried to hide from each other had become each other's witnesses. Maybe that was the real ending. Not forgiveness, not revenge, but understanding. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the small silver key I'd kept all this time. I'd meant to throw it away after the case ended, but somehow it had stayed with me, a reminder of what truth costs. I dropped it into the water. It made no sound I could hear, just a ripple vanishing into gray. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and opened my journal again. The pages had grown thick with entries, some bitter, some calm, some so quiet they barely took up space. I wrote, "There's a kind of freedom that doesn't look like flight. It looks like standing still and realizing no one's chasing you anymore." I closed the book and turned out the light. The wind outside hummed softly, steady as breathing. For the first time in years, I didn't think of what was owed, only of what had already been paid in full.